Do 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 boo do do dun 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 bum 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 bum. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to Bearing the Brunt, and I'm your host, Joel Van Brunt. Little John Williams for you, Indiana Jones theme. I used to play that on trumpet. I played trumpet for, 12 years or something when I was growing up in elementary school, junior high, and high school, and a little bit in college. And that was one of my favorite themes to play on trumpet because it's such a great trumpet melody in popular culture and very, very fun. So, welcome. Like I said, Bearing the Brunt, I'm Joel Van Brunt, your host. If you are going to outsource your thinking to anyone, why not do it with somebody you trust? And if you're not going to outsource your thinking, then good, because I can point you to where you can find some good information to round out your opinion about things. My goal is to develop grown-up conversations, not fifth grade shouting matches at recess. Have you seen that before? Have you seen that recently? It's kind of in the headlines. It's in the media. It's everywhere. Shouting matches between fifth graders. I hope to help you build discernment, wisdom, and learn some control of your emotions so you don't get blinded to information that might be relevant to a particular issue or a particular person. And why wouldn't you want more civil dialogue? Seriously, why not? Intro to me. I'm here to help you, guide you through the fog of war. And we experience a fog of war in life, don't we? Philosophically, politically, culturally, we experience a fog of war. What does that mean? It means we have conflicting, contradictory information. We've got this information, we've got that information. It doesn't always match up. Sometimes it does. And we have to navigate that and string a narrative along to develop an awareness of where we are in life, where we are metaphysically, and make some commitments. And a lot of that has to do with our background and what we're exposed to growing up, maybe what we studied in school, maybe what disciplines we're most interested in, and of course, what news sources we partake in. And by the nature of choosing some sources over others, you are excluding sources because we all have limited time. And so if you have only a limited scope of information that you're taking in, perhaps you are not aware of other information that might be relevant. So that's what I'm here to do, try to provide you with some relevance and think past some of the things that you might be thinking if you are limited in your scope with the information you're taking in. I have 20 years experience in the military, in the private sector, in the arts. I was a starving actor for a bit in LA. I went to grad school, got a public policy degree, did a startup for a bit, and then most recently I've been with a small company for the last 7 years in various capacities. I'm still affiliated with the military, and I've managed and led people up to about 270, 280 people in various capacities. So I've had direct reports. I've had many, many direct reports and middle managers that have been between me and the frontline staff for about the last 5 years. So I have a very unique perspective. I'm also an engineering major from Northwestern University, so I've got this technical side. I've got this artistic side. Like I said, a starving actor in LA. If you look behind me over here, there's a guitar. If I was to pan around the room, you see a bunch of other instruments. I used to record music quite a bit and write music when I was growing up. I haven't done it recently. Well, I have, just not in the capacity I used to. I had a goal of being a film composer when I was a kid, so I used to listen to a lot of John Williams, thus the opening intro. So that's a little bit about me. Bottom line, my philosophy on life is we take data points in life and we string a narrative right through those data points. And that could be your interactions with a person, your interactions with an idea, with a concept, and you start to make sense of that idea, concept, person by stringing a narrative to explain what you're observing, to make sense of the data. But, if you only have 2, 3, 4, 10 data points, you, by definition, don't have all the other data points that might be pertinent to that narrative. So I'm trying to help challenge, create this dynamic, reflective equilibrium where you're getting information that's kind of pushing against your prior information and hopefully developing some good outcomes and some deeper understandings about the way things are. So I mentioned this a while back that I'm very weary of experts, and I've been talking a lot about the models with COVID-19, and with a technical background, at least academically, I have some familiarity with looking at the numbers. And I've cited scientists from Israel and from San Francisco who've looked at the data. They're data scientists or mathematicians, and make certain predictions and make certain assumptions about the infection rate across the U.S. and across different regions. There's a good data scientist who looked at Iceland. That was in a Medium article that I talked about a few days ago. But what I've developed over time is a healthy skepticism of experts. And what I found going all the way back to when I was in grad school, and even in the military to a certain degree, because there's an expert way of thinking in the military as well, that the more highly specified you in whatever it is, whether it's a discipline, an academic discipline, or maybe you got a PhD, or if it's some sort of job discipline, or just the older you get as you kind of go through life and you get more specified in performing life, then you become a little bit more resistant to information that challenges your prior assumptions, information that challenges your narrative. Have you noticed that? And so I thought that what I'd start off with today is this great quote by Thomas Sowell. If you don't know who Thomas Sowell is, you should. He is one of my favorite intellectuals, and one of the guys that I admire most in life. He is at the Hoover Institution in Stanford University. He's an economics PhD by background, and he has taught all over the U.S., but he's most recently been in the Hoover Institution. Well, I think he's been there for the last 40 years or so. So I found this quote in Twitter, and it was just posted yesterday, and I thought I'd bookmark it because it really drives home the skepticism of experts that I think is warranted in our times. And here's the skepticism. Here's a quote. "In all ignorance, the ignorance of the educated is the most dangerous. Not only are educated people likely to have more influence, they are the last people to suspect that they don't know what they are talking about when they go outside their narrow fields." So, of all ignorance, the ignorance of the educated is the most dangerous. Not only are educated people likely to have more influence, they are the last people to suspect that they don't know what they are talking about when they go outside their narrow fields. And I thought that was just really, really excellent. So be skeptical of experts. And now, however, I know this says outside of their narrow fields, but I will say that there is a healthy dialogue to happen cross-discipline. When you have experts in other fields look at epidemiology, for example, like data scientists and mathematicians, it can reveal some input that might be pertinent to the epidemiologist models. And I had a professor in grad school who was my econometrics professor. Econometrics is a fancy statistical method where you do regression analysis, and I won't get into the details, but this is how a lot of social science is dealt with big data sets. And he spent his career critiquing medical articles in journals for the shoddy methodology from his perspective. Now, the medical journals would present this information from usually doctors or epidemiologists, and here's this economist who's coming in and poking holes in their methodology. And for the most part, he was right. Like in almost every case, he had very, very sharp critiques of the methodology and epidemiology. So I have a very firsthand experience with how some of these things might be wrong. And the models are only as good as the assumptions that get put in. And the assumptions are subject to the fog of war. We don't really have good data. So that's a good intro for being skeptical of experts. I wanted to start big to small. COVID improvement plan updates. I did not exercise today. I had a good workout yesterday. And I also went in to my former place of business today. Why? Because we got approved for the PPP loan, the Payment Protection Plan loan, which says you can, if you're a small business, you can hire your people back, but you have to hire a certain number of people back to have the loan forgiven. And then you have to pay them near what you paid them before. There's some flexibility with that. And so my previous boss called me and a few other people in, the leadership of the company, to discuss how we wanted to proceed with this and try to investigate if there's any risk with doing this. In other words, the guidance for the PPP loans has changed 3 times. And if you're not a small business owner, you don't know that. But the guidance has changed 3 times. And so you're not really sure if the guidance is going to change again. So if you start to implement this and then the guidance changes and, oh, hey, by the way, we said it was for this, but you get penalized for this, and it's something that we weren't expecting, then it opens up the company to risk. So we're discussing that today. And it was really interesting to see in real time how these loans impact the incentives they bring, impact business decision making. So for us, we took it as, primarily a way for people to come off unemployment and have their employer pay them in some senses unemployment because the demand hasn't returned. I mean, a lot of small businesses, if you don't have demand, it doesn't make sense to have people hired if there's no demand. You can't stay in business. So this is kind of a way to be in a holding pattern, if you like, and have your employees there so that when, we come out of this thing and if the demand comes back, which is the big uncertainty, then you have the people in place where you can service that demand and get back to work. But it was interesting just to see how the thought process worked out in a small business environment. We want to do right by our employees. And in some cases, what we paid them, entry level, hourly wages, doing the calculations, let's say they were part-time or just over full-time. Then you do their weekly wages and you look at what the federal stimulus plus the $1,200 plus the $600 on top of employment, which in Hawaii can be up to $600, $600+ a week just from the state. And now you're talking like they can make, in 1 month, they can make $4,000 or $5,000. And that might be more than what we were paying them from an entry-level position. So it really impacted the way we thought about, well, shoot, does the employee that we really like, we liked our team when we had to let everybody go, does the employee that we really like, but we were paying, $14, $15 an hour, whatever it was, do they actually financially do better if they stay on unemployment? If that's the case, then we need to be careful about how we give them an offer letter, because if they turn down work, well, that impacts their unemployment status, assuming they're honest on their unemployment status, right? So all these little incentives that play out that if you're not in small business, you would never see. So that was a really interesting idea for me. And by the way, this is not the only loan that the business applied for. There's a bunch of other loans that we applied for too that we're, kind of waiting on to see what happens. Apparently, the airline stimulus or bailout money might trickle down to Part 135 operators, which is smaller air carriers that are unscheduled. So not scheduled like the airlines, but unscheduled. So that's who I worked for the last 7 years. So anyway, so that was a really interesting behind the scenes peek. It was kind of fun to see the incentives, how they all play out, to be involved in those discussions, to talk about different courses of action, and really to, at the center of it, try to do what's best for our employees. And it reminded me that I haven't received the stimulus yet. So I haven't received my unemployment, and I haven't received the federal stimulus money yet. So have you? Now I'm finding out that this is more widespread than I thought. And so there's other people who haven't received it yet. I talked to some of my direct reports today, my former direct reports, I guess, and they hadn't received any money either. So I guess that's pretty common. We'll see what happens. I talked to one of my direct reports in another capacity, and he's an accountant or accountant assistant, and he hasn't seen his money or the money, the federal stimulus money either, and a lot of unemployment money hasn't rolled out yet. So really interesting. This actually exposes what private enterprise might be able to do better than government, and that is disperse funds to the people who need it. So you get this loan through the banks, and now all of a sudden we can bring people on payroll maybe next week whenever we get the funds in, and boom, they're getting paid. And maybe it's another several weeks before they get their unemployment benefits with the federal kick-up. So that was interesting. And it also reminded me of how private enterprise might be better at distribution too, which, the supply chain has been a big discussion in this COVID thing, and having supply chain items in other countries. So China produces a lot of our pharmaceuticals. They produce a lot of our medical equipment. Is that wise strategically? Is that wise for our national interests? And so this has raised a whole bunch of different questions about our supply chains and how international and connected they are when we have to shut down borders and stop people from coming in and shut down flights to other places from this pandemic. Now, there were people who predicted this a while back, sure, that this was kind of what kept them up at night. But me, a layperson, who would have thought, I thought the interconnectedness was, we're already done with that. We're beyond that. We just got to assume that that's the way the world's going to be for the next 50, 100 years. But this is kind of calling into question that assumption. Does it make sense to have our supply chains spread out across all these different countries and different regions around the world? Maybe not, because of this situation where you have China maybe stopping things coming into the U.S. or U.S. customs in China. I have a report from a buddy of mine who does business in China where U.S. Customs was stopping shipments in China because there was so much counterfeiting for things that the U.S. needed in this pandemic. So it raises a lot of interesting questions about our supply chain. And I'll get more into some of that in a bit. Here in Hawaii, the Hawaii Tourism Authority is starting to pay people to leave if they're tourists and they don't abide by the 14-day quarantine as set forth by the governor. So if they can't, for whatever reason, do the 14-day quarantine, then the Hawaii Tourism Authority is paying them to go back. And this is interesting because this PPP loan has come down and, we might be hiring people back, including myself. I'm not officially hired yet, but hopefully, over the weekend, the funds get dispersed and I can get back in some capacity in the leadership of the company. And in the meantime, we have so much uncertainty about what the demand signal is going to look like when we come out of this. What's it going to look like in June? What's it going to look like in July? So if we hire everybody back at the head count that the PPP requires, then 2 months when the term expires, we might be back to just letting people go unless there's another stimulus if the demand signal's not there. Does that make sense? So it's a way to kind of float people for 2 months at a minimum, but we can't guarantee anything after that. So we have to be very honest in managing the expectations of the people we bring on and say, look, this is a limited thing for 2 months. We don't know what it looks like beyond the 2 months. We can't promise anything, but this is probably going to be a better deal than unemployment because you're back on the company's health care. And in most cases, it pays more than the unemployment insurance plus the federal markup plus the stimulus. But in some cases, it doesn't. So we're just trying to figure all that stuff out. I love, there's times where I really love our country. I'm in love with it. I served for it for 20 plus years so far. I've deployed to combat for it, for our country. So I love our country, but there's so many interesting things that are coming out of this stay at home. So there's this video circulating around on social media that is the stuntmen and stunt women basically doing a fight scene under the stay-at-home order. And so it's a series of videos where, the one stuntman punches the camera and then another stuntman receives the blow at a different location, different house, and does some stunts. And it's just fantastic. It's just an awesome, awesome video. And it makes me appreciate the way of life that we have here in the U.S., where you have that creativity to do that and post it and people get enjoyment out of it. It's just phenomenal. And I can't, it's difficult to imagine that kind of freedom and creativity to that degree being in other places. Not saying that it's not. It certainly is in Europe and South America and other places, but just that freedom, free spirit, creative energy, and entertainment that we were able to produce even in the midst of trials like this. So check that out, this video on stuntmen and stuntwomen doing fight scenes while stay at home. So that was really cool to see. Also, there was another thing going around. I don't know if I put it in my thread or not. I don't think I did, but there was a rant video that sounds like the guys from New York, and I apologize. I don't have the guy's name. Actually, I may have the name here. If you give me 1 second, let's see. No. Nope, I don't have it. Oh well. Anyway, he goes on a rant about having mortgages be kind of delayed for a couple months, or car payments, or that kind of thing. And it went viral. And this guy's in his car, and he goes on this rant, and he's spitting, and he says, "Why don't you just take 3 months of payments and just tack it onto the back of the loan? It's not that hard, and really makes a case for the average person who's living paycheck to paycheck. They get the stimulus money. Great, that covers maybe mortgage. But what about food, and what about all these other bills? So his point was, if we're all in this together, let's really all be in this together to include the lenders. Let's pay it forward or pass on some of those rent payments and tack them on later in the cycle of the loan. So that was pretty good, and I just like that we have that freedom where people can rant like that and express their view, and it goes viral, and it gets a lot of attention, a lot of comments, and a lot of good discussion. So check that out if you're on social media. All right, COVID-19 updates. Some sad news. I was personally affected by a COVID death last week. A high school friend of mine, his father passed away on Monday, a week ago from Monday. So we're about 10 days after his passing right now as I record this. And I knew his father since fourth grade. I was always over at their house. They had a cabin on a lake, a cottage on a lake that we would go to every summer. And so he was in the hospital. He actually contracted this, they believe, in the hospital, and then passed away. So they were on the phone with him for about 30 hours. My buddy and his siblings, 2 sisters, were on the phone with him for 30 hours before he passed away, just, singing to him and telling him the things they needed to tell him, and having that closure. And my buddy's sister, who I also knew and have known forever, she was profiled by Anderson Cooper a couple nights ago. So Anderson Cooper, CNN anchor, and so he profiled her, and then the CNN wrote up an article about it, and it was a good article, and she had some great quotes. She told him what she admired about him, and she thanked him for certain things, and she also forgave him for certain things that she was still holding in. And I just thought how nice that she had that opportunity. And I thought, how many of us don't have the opportunity to forgive our parents or our loved ones before they're gone? And the psychological drain that might play on us for the rest of our lives if we haven't had that opportunity, or the last time we talked to them, if we didn't say we love them. So I just thought that was a really nice picture of end of life, where you have that closure, you're able to communicate your heart, and then you don't feel like there's something unsettled or unfinalized when that time happens. So, I'm glad that was profiled, and people saw that and got perhaps some encouragement for that. And in other sad news, you may have seen that Elizabeth Warren's oldest brother, Donald Reed Herring, also died of COVID earlier this week. That was reported in Vox. So this is having an impact, folks. It's having a big impact. There's no doubt. And chances are that more of us, as time goes on, will be impacted by people we know, love, and admire who succumb to this disease. I do want to talk about the fog of war recently that's come up in a slew of articles. I've been talking for a while, and by a while I mean 3 weeks or so, about the modeling with COVID-19 and about some dissenting views on the death rates and some dissenting views on the infection rates. I've cited studies in Germany, studies in Iceland that were referenced by data scientists in San Francisco, a mathematician in Israel, and some tests that the Navy's done, the French Navy's done, and pregnant women in New York City. In other words, there's all these tests. They did an antibody test in Santa Clara, and then they just recently did an antibody test in LA County as well. So there's a whole bunch of information coming out. And in particular, there's 2 articles in the New York Times that talk about more people having this disease than previously believed. And so the New York Times actually has a headline that basically says 1 in 5 New Yorkers may have had COVID-19, antibody test suggests. What? 1 in 5 New Yorkers may have had COVID-19, antibody test suggests. How many New Yorkers are there? 10 million? With all the boroughs? I don't know. Let's see. Hey, Siri. How many people are in New York City?
As of 2018, the population of New York City was 8,398,748.
Okay, so 8,400,000. All right. Now, I'm going to pull up the most recent death certificate or death number from New York City. This is the COVID-19 tracker from the New York City Health Department. Nope, that's the wrong one. That's for the state. I want the New York City. This is from nyc.gov. All right. So confirmed deaths. Is this right? Okay, confirmed deaths, 10,290. Probable deaths, 5,121. So I'm going to do this in real time. I want to see, let's call it 15,300 divided by, what was it, 8.4 million? 8,400, 1, 2, 3. Okay. So that would be a mortality rate of 0.18. 0.18. That's way lower than what we were thinking before. So that's very positive. New York Times also has an article on how hidden outbreaks spread earlier in various metropolitan areas. So I'm going to read a little bit of this. By the time New York City confirmed its first case of the coronavirus on March 1st, thousands of infections were already silently spreading through the city, a hidden explosion of a disease that many still viewed as a remote threat as the city awaited the first signs of spring. Hidden outbreaks were also spreading almost completely undetected in Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, and Seattle, long before testing showed that each city had a major problem, according to a model of the spread of the disease by researchers at Northeastern University who shared their results with the New York Times. In early February, while the world focused on China, the virus was not only likely to be spreading in multiple American cities, but also seeding blooms or infections elsewhere in the United States, the researchers found. So, in 5 major cities, as of March 1st, there were only 23 confirmed cases of coronavirus. But, according to the Northeastern model, there could have actually been about 28,000 infections in those cities by then. So that's basically for every confirmed case, there were 1,000 infections that were undetected or unknown at the time. That's amazing. That's amazing. And also lends support to this idea that more people have had it than we previously thought. So all this data is starting to link together. So we have a whole bunch of different confirming pieces of evidence. And I want to go through them just briefly. And if you're curious, go back in my podcasts and my archive and previous episodes where I talk about this on a fairly routine basis. But we have the Israeli mathematician that was reported in the Jerusalem Post. We have the town in Germany that tested, I think, everybody in a town and came up with a 15% infection rate in that town, something like that. We have the pregnant women in New York City where that suggested about the same thing, about a 14 or 15% infection rate and only about a 3% presentation rate where they actually develop symptoms. And then we have the antibody test in Santa Clara outside of San Francisco. Then we have the Los Angeles antibody test. Now we have the New York City antibody test, which suggests 1 in 5 New Yorkers. We have the data scientists from San Francisco who looked at Iceland and compared the Icelandic distribution because Iceland did wide-scale testing. They have a small population. They did over 1,000, so it started to become representative, at least according to this data scientist. And then he interpolated the numbers from Europe onto the Icelandic distribution and concluded that the actual number of cases was massively more than the number of reported cases in Europe. And he made probably the most optimistic assumptions about the transmission rates and the fatality rate. So all this is coming together to suggest that we're still in the fog of war. We still don't really have a firm understanding of how widespread this is, how many people have actually had it already and never developed symptoms and were asymptomatic. And I've been saying the asymptomatic thing is a big problem in the denominator and has been for the last 4 weeks. So in addition to the wide scale nature of this virus, there's some other interesting tidbits that have come out that add to the fog of war that we're dealing with. Number one, there's a political article on the testing snafu. And a couple days ago, I think on Saturday, I talked about snafu. So situation normal, all effed up, right? And then foobar, effed up beyond all whatever. And then a S-storm, and all these different terms that apply to organizational behavior. You'll find people inside of organizations that will talk to each other. And this is particularly from the military, and having a military background, I was immediately familiar with these terms. And I've used them myself. My peers have used them. My Marines have used them. And we had a saying in the Marine Corps early on in our development that if the Marines aren't complaining, then something's wrong, right? So Marines complain, and that's true of any organization where the entry-level positions, or you can find different aspects of the company that are not really happy with how things are being run at the top. Even if the top has great intentions and highly admired, there's always people who don't understand, and the expectations aren't getting met. There's just a disconnect. There's friction inside the organization anywhere. And so I just thought it was interesting that this snafu organizational behavior concept started to get brought in by Politico to describe the testing situation. And it talked about different companies. It talked about bringing on capacity in the states. It talked about a slew a wide variance in the number of tests that doctors think that we need. And so I just want to quote one section of this Politico article that says, health experts outside the government say that the true testing need is even greater than what the government's saying, which is about 1 million tests per week. They predict it will take 4 million to 30 million tests per week to begin reopening the country and keep it open until a vaccine becomes available, which could take months or even years. So that, with the information I just presented, with the fact that there's a lot of data points lining up that there might be way more people who have this thing than we previously realized, which means the mortality rate goes down. So do we really need 30 million tests before we open? Really? I mean, do we really need that? Scott Gottlieb was interviewed on Ben Shapiro over the weekend. I covered this a few days ago, and he was suggesting maybe upwards of, 300,000 a day. I think it was a day. It might have been a week, but I think it was 300,000 a day. So that would be just shy of 3 million per week. So that's what his suggestion was. And that's on the lower end. And he says we're almost there. We're already at 100,000 a day. So we just need to ramp it up to 300,000 a day. So what's the truth? Do you know? Do I know? Does anybody know? Do these experts know? Do these experts really know that that's what we need? This is just a suggestion. These are experts. And there's other considerations, right? There's other considerations like the people that we might hire back and paying bills and their mental health and getting back to work and just the grinding halt that this has done with the economy. There's a whole trickle down of unintended consequences from shutting down the economy. So anyway, I just throw that into the fog of war discussion. But there's one more piece of information I wanted to cover. And this one is very interesting. So New York Times again reporting that Chinese agents helped spread messages that sowed virus panic in the U.S., officials say. So American officials were alarmed by fake text messages and social media posts that said President Trump was locking down the country. Experts see a convergence with Russian tactics. The alarming messages came fast and furious in mid-March, popping up in the cell phone screens and social media feeds of millions of Americans grappling with the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. Spread the word, the messages said. The Trump administration was about to lock down the entire country. Quote, they will announce this as soon as they have troops in place to help prevent looters and rioters, warned one of the messages, which cited a source in the Department of Homeland Security. He said he got the call last night and was told to pack and be prepared for the call today with his dispatch orders. The messages became so widespread over 48 hours that the White House's National Security Council issued an announcement via Twitter that they were fake. Since that wave of panic, United States intelligence agencies have assessed that Chinese operatives helped push the messages across platforms, according to 6 American officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity to publicly discuss intelligence matters. The amplification techniques are alarming to officials because the disinformation showed up as texts on many Americans' cell phones, a tactic that several of the officials said they had not seen before. That has spurred agencies to look at new ways in which China, Russia, and other nations are using a range of platforms to spread disinformation during the pandemic, they said. So not only did the information coming out of China not help with response around the world for this crisis, but then, and this took place, I think down later in the article, it talks about this taking place in early March, right? So this is in March. After China went through the whole COVID stuff, we had the whole World Health Organization backing up the China storyline, which was it couldn't transmit between humans and no need to shut down travel. And China has it under control. And all this inaccurate information, I'm not going to talk about intent, but just inaccurate, unhelpful information. And by the time things got spun around and Europe and the US started to go into react mode, at the same time, they were sowing this disinformation. That's not great. That's really not great. So decoupling with China, I think, is going to happen. I think we're going to start moving manufacturing out of there. There was a report a couple of weeks ago about Japan actually paying their companies to come out of China and either come back to Japan or elsewhere. So I think that China is going to suffer greatly because of this economically as people start to decouple. Countries, different nations start to decouple with the Chinese manufacturing base. So that'll be interesting. And supply chain, hopefully that'll shore up security-wise the supply chain with, strong ally countries or even internal in our country. That might raise prices, but luckily the government's printing a lot of money, so we should have more money for these higher prices. That's kind of a joke. Anyway, on reopening, I did want to briefly cite a couple things. There's a Washington Post article. Was it a Washington Post? Let's see. Yeah, not Washington Post. This is from Reason. This is an article from Reason.com. So my notes are a little bit in error, but so this article basically kind of summarizes what I've just been ranting about. And so I thought if you don't believe me, here's another source. And it's by a guy named Jacob Sowell. And the title of it is, Shouldn't COVID-19's Lethality Inform the Response to It? Seems like a reasonable question. So let's see what he has to say. Again, Jacob Sowell. Okay. When she announced the startling results of a new COVID-19 study on Monday, Los Angeles County's top public health official emphasized that the number of infections far exceeds the official count of confirmed cases. She underplayed another important implication of the study. COVID-19 seems to be far less deadly than many people feared. The way Department of Public Health Director Barbara Ferrer framed the study's results raises a question that policymakers across the country will confront as they consider when and how to loosen sweeping restrictions aimed at curtailing the COVID-19 epidemic. Will they be guided by emerging evidence, or will they use it to support the policies they already favored? I've been talking about attaching your favorite policy proposals and policy agenda to this crisis and being very wary of that. So that's what this author is talking about. The Los Angeles County study, conducted by University of Southern California researchers in collaboration with Ferrer's department, tested a representative sample of 863 adults for antibodies of the virus in early April. About 4% of them tested positive, indicating that the number of adults in the county who had been infected by the virus was roughly 40 times the number of confirmed cases at the time. Confirmed cases are limited to people who have tested positive for the virus, and testing so far has been skewed toward people with severe symptoms. Since people infected by the virus typically experience mild to no symptoms, it is not surprising that the official tally understates the number of infections, although the apparent size of the gap is striking. And this is a quote from her, "These results indicate that many persons may have been unknowingly infected and at risk of transmitting the virus to others, Ferrer said. These findings underscore the importance of expanded virus testing to diagnose those with infection so they can be isolated and quarantined while also maintaining the broad social distancing interventions. Since the number of infections in Los Angeles County is much higher than official numbers indicated, Ferrer told reporters, the risk of transmission is higher than expected, which reinforces the case of aggressive control measures, including broad business closure and stay-at-home orders. At the time, she said, the fact that 95% or so of the country's adult population remains uninfected shows those measures are working. Okay. The question is especially pressing in light of the fatality rate implied by the study. In contrast to the current crude case fatality rate of about 4.5%, Ferrer said, the study suggests that a 0.1% to 0.2% of people infected by the virus will die, which would make COVID-19 only somewhat more deadly than the seasonal flu. Do I still have the number up of what I just did? Yeah. That would be 0.18%. That's the New York study that I just cited from the New York Times. So now we have LA and New York agreeing between 0.1 and 0.2%. There you have it. Now, I'm not saying that's right. Let's be clear. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying that there's a lot of data points that are suggesting that this is the case. And so this article is making it the point that why wouldn't we let that drive our policy decisions? Okay. Policymakers right now are choosing between lockdowns and nothing. They are choosing between lockdowns. Policymakers right now are not choosing between lockdowns and nothing. They are choosing between lockdowns and less costly, more carefully targeted measures. That choice should be informed by evidence that undercuts their worst fears, which is this massive death rate, 4.5%, 3.9%, whatever it is nationally. If you take the number of confirmed cases as the denominator and the number of deaths as the numerator, you're somewhere in the neighborhood of around 4%. I haven't done it in a few days, but that was what we were around when I was doing the calculation daily. But if this is saying that there's 30 times more people in the denominator, all of a sudden it's an order of magnitude, more than an order of magnitude below that mortality rate. So there you have it. Now, I love this article out of CNBC. First of all, I'm getting more acquainted with CNBC because I'm playing the stock market every morning. So, I get news from there from time to time. I got to get better at cycling that news to give me real-time information. By the way, today was much better than yesterday, so that's good. Anyway, the title of this article is Massive Layoffs and Pay Cuts Are Likely Coming to State and Local Governments as Federal Aid Goes Elsewhere. So... So this is kind of the fight that you probably heard about in Congress, where the Democrats were trying to attach a lot of state and local bailouts to stimulus measures aimed at small businesses. And what I found interesting about this is, doesn't it make sense, and isn't it kind of okay that public sector people would be going on furlough or possibly going through layoffs if that's what everybody else in the country is doing? Doesn't that seem fair? Or would you want to disproportionately want to bail out the public sector, and to their credit, bail out the private sector too, but not before all the negative impact has already been felt, and not all of it, but a lot of it. And there's an article I went over, I can't remember, last week or something, that said there's potentially up to 3.5 million to 7 million small businesses that just aren't going to open back up. Regardless of stimulus money, because the demand signal is too uncertain down the road. So the impact has already been felt, and you can't really come back from it. I mean, you can. We're going to get out of this, But those people who've lost their businesses and people who've lost their jobs through those businesses, that impact's already been felt, regardless of the stimulus, regardless of PPP, regardless of these other loan, opportunities that come down the pipeline. So doesn't it make sense that you would, maybe furlough some workers? There was an article in New Zealand that, and this was through some Harvard connections of mine, that said that the New Zealand Prime Minister was going to take a pay cut, and some of her staff and other people in public service were going to take a pay cut. Great. Why doesn't Congress do that, right? Why isn't there a bill that says, hey, we'll take a 25% pay cut for the time being? Now it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but symbolically and signaling to the American public, very, very powerful. So Congress, why not? Why not do it? I mean, the president already doesn't take a salary. So if he did take a salary, I would say he should do the same thing. Maybe the vice president, though. Maybe some other people in the executive branch could as a symbolic measure, do the same thing. So I thought that was interesting that I don't want anybody to lose their job, and as a federal employee for a long, long time, I was insulated by that job from some of the recessions of the past, the dot-com bubble in the late 90s and Y2K, if you guys remember that. So I was insulated against some of these recessions and a little bit also with the 2008 recession because I was still affiliated with the military in a significant way. I still am today, but a little bit more so back then. And I guess I had more participation back then. So I appreciate, having a stable job, and I'm actually seeing it in one of my capacities where half the organization is full-time affiliated with the government and half the organization is part-time affiliated with the government. And the part-timers are going through unemployment and disruption in education and life plans. And the full-time people are, boy, that sucks. Good thing we're still getting our paychecks on the 1st and 15th of every month. And that's great. I don't begrudge anybody for anything. I'm just saying that it's interesting that this article came out that the states and local governments might be going through the same thing the airlines did, the same thing we did, the same thing that other small businesses did. So I think it's okay. And maybe they suffer a little bit with us. And I want them all to get rehired, all of them to get rehired. So there you have it. There's also another article out of the Washington Post that talks about potentially some food disruption. And I saw Mike Cernovich tweet about this, looking at meat processing plants. I haven't seen the source material for that yet, but there's another article in the Washington Post that talks about the disconnect between farmers and food banks that are servicing the people who need the food the most. I think there's somewhere around 700 across the country. And the problem is that the farms are over here, the food banks are all over here, and you got to transport stuff from here to there, and the transport is getting messed up. And so the supply chain is getting a little bit frictiony, which may not go well if allowed to continue for too long. So this is suggesting that there might be some disruptions in the food chain, supply chain. So let me just read a little bit from this. Over the past 6 weeks, the networks of food banks that collect surplus farm commodities and donated food from grocery stores and restaurants and distribute it to needy Americans have faced unprecedented demand because of the record unemployment and a dramatic increase in households reporting food insecurity. The U.S. Department of Agriculture's most recent hunger report, published in September 2019, estimated that 37 million people were food insecure in the United States. Feeding America, a nationwide network with more than 200 food banks, predicts an additional 17.1 million Americans will have trouble feeding themselves and their families as a result of the pandemic. So the other big thing in this article that kind of came out is that there's a lot of pivoting in the food industry because a lot of source material that's going to restaurants has to get redirected to go to grocery stores. And so there's a lot of moving parts that are behind the scenes that probably the average person doesn't see and wouldn't even know is happening. And all that disruption is causing some friction in the supply chain for food. So keep an eye on that. We'll see how that story develops over the next couple weeks. Briefly, a couple political things, and this is just following up on some stuff I've talked about in previous episodes. So number one, the recent declassification of footnotes in the IG Horowitz report regarding FBI applications for FISA warrants for Carter Page with the Trump administration. Not looking very good for the FBI. And then so a lot of this comes from John Solomon. He's an independent reporter who breaks a lot of this stuff, and he's criticized by a lot of mainstream media as being, kind of wacky and conspiracy theory. And I talked about conspiracy theory and investigative journalism yesterday or the day before. I don't want to belabor that, but basically it's really easy to undermine somebody's information by just name calling them, a conspiracy theory propagators. Not to say that there's not conspiracy theory people out there. There are. But we have to analyze what they're reporting, and if they're jumping beyond their skis, if they're trying to, prove too much with their conclusions, and certainly that happens. But sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes when it doesn't, and it's a legitimate investigative task to go down this road, the criticism of conspiracy theory is not warranted. But it's effective because then people tune it out, right? So I really like John Solomon's reporting. I think he's gotten a bad rap. And I wanted to just... he has an article. He has his own website that's basically called Just the News. And this article basically is a criticism of John Brennan. And the criticism comes from former Moscow station chief Daniel Hoffman from the CIA. And this is his quote. And the reason this quote stuck out at me is because it's in line with a lot of themes of this live stream and podcast. And that is, we draw narratives, we have a worldview, and we're subject to confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance, like Scott Adams says all the time. Scott Adams, the cartoonist, Dilbert cartoonist, he talks about confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance. If you study behavioral economics, which I did in grad school, you will see a whole slew of different heuristics and biases that we as humans are subject to. Pretty repeatable data in the social science literature. And if you read books like Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, phenomenal book. It'll change how you think about people. But this is kind of in this quote is really telling and revelatory about this narrative theme I talk about. You have data points, you draw a narrative, you are kind of anchored to that narrative, and then you push against any kind of information that might flex against that narrative. So with that in mind, here's the quote. And this comes again from former CIA Moscow chief Daniel Hoffman. Quote, "One of the things that bothers me the most is when someone kind of starts with their answer and then they try to twist the facts to fit it." So let me read that again. One of the things that bothers me the most is when someone kind of starts with the answer and then they try to twist the facts to fit it. Hoffman said Tuesday. "I saw Brennan do that when I served under him at the CIA, and I saw him do that when he was, a contributor at MSNBC, accusing the president of treason with nothing whatsoever to back it up." So that's former Moscow station chief. Of course, you could attack his credibility if you are on Brennan's side, and I'm sure, no doubt, people will do that. But I just thought that interesting, that his critique was exactly what I'm talking about, is you try to fit disconfirming information, you already have the answer. So this is my big critique of anti-Trump people, whether it's on the right or the left, is they already have their answer. Their answer is Trump is evil. And then every fact that they find, whether it's a tweet or whether it's a press news conference statement or whether it's some sort of action, it fits in that narrative. And it doesn't even matter. And I had this joke, I think I actually put this on Twitter, that I actually think that Trump could deliver a baby in the lobby of Trump Tower in New York City, and certain people would find a way to criticize him for that. I honestly do. Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me I'm wrong. All right. So that's John Brennan. And then real quickly, I talked also about the different treatment between Brett Kavanaugh and Joe Biden with regard to the Me Tooing of those two individuals. And a while back, I actually compared two New York Times stories that dealt with Christine Blasey Ford and Tara Reade, and just how widely divergent the style was in those two articles. And they happen to be some of the earliest articles on those two women, and how it really revealed a very different style. And it actually made you more emotionally connected to Christine Blasey Ford. With Tara Reade, it made you more objectively kind of questioning if this is real. But Sean Hannity, who I don't watch typically, but he had a tweet from the GregJarrett.com site. So Greg Jarrett is another Fox contributor. And the title is, CNN did 700 stories on Kavanaugh, and asking a question, will they give alleged Biden victim the same courtesy? So it's designed to draw out the hypocrisy between the two treatments of these women. So you can find that. This is on thegregjarrett.com. And I don't think there's anything I wanted to quote in this article. But I did find it interesting that they actually counted 700 stories. So, here's the piece that talks about the New York Times treatment, which I mentioned about, I think it was on Easter Sundays when the article came out. So the New York Times devoted an entire lengthy report on discrediting the victim. Ironically, or perhaps just moronically, in that piece, they actually completely validated her. Quote, no other allegation about sexual assault surfaced in the course of our reporting, nor did any former Biden staff corroborate Reed's allegation, wrote the Times. So the standard of guilt simply relies on if there was more than one victim, or if a specifically chosen handful of people were unaware of the incident. Don't insult our intelligence. It gets better. The Times added that, and then removed the following sentence. Quote, we found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Biden beyond hugs, kisses, and touching that women previously said made them uncomfortable, end quote. Looks like sexual misconduct such as unwarranted hugs, kisses, and touching is not really sexual misconduct for the Times. Town Hall writer and Fox News contributor eloquently stated, liberals disconnect in a tweet. Town Hall writer and Fox News contributor eloquently stated liberals disconnect in a tweet. Quote, I don't know whether Miss Reed is telling the truth and the presumption of innocence is a vital pillar of our justice system, but this detail alone presents more contemporaneous evidence against Biden than was ever presented against Kavanaugh, and then posting the following excerpt from the New York Times article, which he was referencing. Quote, a friend said Tara Reid told her the details of the allegation at the time, and another friend and a brother of Reid's said she told them over the years about a traumatic sexual incident involving Biden. So, and this jumped out in the article when I read it. I don't remember if I mentioned it in the episode I talked about it, but I'm pretty sure I did. So, to refresh your memory, basically, Tara Reid told somebody in 1993 timeframe that this happened, and then she later told her family that something happened. That was a distinct difference than Christine Blasey Ford. She claimed she had told people, but those claims turned out to be unsubstantiated when those people were asked. And there's nobody she told really close to the event in 1983 or whatever the year was. So that fact alone makes Tara Reid's allegation slightly more credible because she actually told people who corroborated her telling them at the time she said she told them. So anyway, that's some developments on that. And then finally, I talked about homeschooling, and I'll end on this. So my great alma mater for grad school, Harvard, has come out against homeschooling. My wife went to Harvard too, and this is out of National Review, and he basically just kind of rips apart this argument. So I want to read a little bit of it, and it'll kind of give you some background if you've missed some of my last episodes. But this is from Kyle Smith, and the title is The Attack on Homeschoolers is an Attack on American Ideals. Listen carefully to the progressive left, and you may discover that when they say democratic values, they mean, I get to tell you what to think. It's nothing new to argue that the people must be forced to conform to the preferences of the cultural elites. It takes a certain mental flexibility to do this in the name of democracy. I refer to the Harvard law professor Elizabeth Bartholet's stated case for why it should be illegal for you to homeschool your children in her Something Must Be Done cry in Harvard Magazine. Bartholet wants the state to ride on a horseback and break up all those sinister gatherings in which families go through the multiplication tables together, or discuss the Constitution, or, sharp intake of breath, even study the Bible. Why is this? Why do I talk about this? Because I went to Harvard, my wife went to Harvard, and we have 4 kids, and we homeschool. Oh, and we read the Bible to them. Shh. Bartholet makes some half-hearted noises about opposing homeschooling because it supposedly leads to child abuse or because homeschool parents are unlettered troglodytes who don't know which end of the pencil the ink comes out of. People can homeschool who've never gone to school themselves, who don't read or write themselves, she claims. These are just warm-up arguments, though, dismantled here and here. Even Bartholet doesn't really seem to believe them. The crux of her case against homeschoolers is that they might grow up thinking thoughts Bartholet does not agree with. That's the risk of homeschooling. So, God forbid we have freedom of thought. It's important, Bartlett tells us, quote, that children grow up exposed to community values, social values, democratic values, ideas about non-discrimination and tolerance of other people's viewpoints. And that's the end quote. Democratic values. Democratic means ruled by the common people, or less literally, people making their own choices rather than being directed from the top down. What could be more bottom-up, more infused with the spirit of the demos than individual families making their own individual curricula without a lot of state intrusion? If Barthelot desires to see the flourishing of ideas about non-discrimination and tolerance of other people's viewpoints, discriminating against people because she is intolerant of their viewpoints is a funny way to show it. Intolerance, even disgust for other people's viewpoints, is all over the paper in the Arizona Law Review article that inspired the Harvard Magazine piece. Professor Bartlett is vibrating at about 50,000 megahertz with righteous panic about the cultural education of homeschooled children. And among the points she makes or quotes approvingly, quote, as time went on, the conservative Christian wing became the clear majority of all homeschoolers, end quote. Many homeschoolers dislike, quote, exposing their children to ideas such as secularism, atheism, feminism, and value relativism, end quote. Homeschoolers consider, quote, even basic literacy to have, quote, little importance compared to unflinching acceptance of religious doctrine and reactionary political views, end quote. Quote, some homeschooling parents are extreme religious ideologues who live in near total isolation and hold views in serious conflict with those generally deemed central to our society, end quote. Quote, homeschoolers are more likely than public schoolers to feel that the dominant U.S. culture was hostile to their moral values and more likely to support a gendered division of labor within the home, end quote. Bartlett knows that homeschools aren't dens of abuse. She's afraid they might be dens of conservatism. For heaven's sake, homeschoolers may even grow up thinking that mommy should do the cooking and daddy should do oil changes. Never mind that most liberals actually live their lives with a heavily gendered division of labor within the home. And if you don't believe me, I can refer you to about 6,000 irate columns by seething liberal women whose liberal husbands aren't doing enough childcare. Bartlett frets that homeschoolers might grow up not even minding the gendered nature of household labor enough to shriek about it in a letter to Dear Prudence. Anyway, I'm going to stop. But this is relevant because we homeschool. We went to Harvard. We are Christians. We read the Bible to our kids. My wife is a stay-at-home mom who homeschools our children. So she naturally does more of the housework than I do. I go work. And we have, we didn't sit down and talk about this, and I didn't demand this from her, and she didn't submit to me to do this. This was her choice, to be clear. My wife chose to stay at home to be with the kids, and she chose to homeschool them. She had a desire to do that. And our kids love learning. Why wouldn't you want your kids to be in an environment where they love learning? And not all, some kids, they get put into a public school or a private school or wherever, and school is a chore, and you have to sit still, and you have to do what the teacher says, and then it becomes a negative, a negative connection with the material, and so then they develop a resistance to it. But if they actually enjoy it and they actually seek out to do it, man, that's awesome. And a lot of homeschoolers are able to accomplish that in ways that don't apply to every student in the normal school system. So that's enough on that. I hope I equipped you with some things to think about. There's one other article that I forgot I was going to talk about. I don't think I'm going to talk about it, but I will talk about it just briefly. This is about talking about reopening and the dangers of reopening. And I kind of missed it in my discussion, but this is out of Washington Post, and the title is Complete Disbelief, Governors Blindside Frontline Staff with Abrupt Reopening Plans. Governors preparing to roll back restrictions put in place to slow the spread of novel coronavirus are in some cases acting without the input and against the wishes of their own medical and emergency management staff. So what's funny is, I think it's in this article. If it is, I apologize for misattribution, but when this author went over to places in Asia, this is not the article. That's not the article. Maybe that is the article. Shucks. I might have lost the article. Oh, I remember the article. It was American leadership. American leadership. Let's see if I can find that. Nope. 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 Shoot. Stick with me. This is, if you want to go away, you can, but stick with me because this might be interesting to talk about. Yeah, here it is. Okay, so this is in the New York Times, and this is backtracking a little bit because, the homeschooling brings up the whole expert, line of reasoning as well. Experts know best, in this case, education experts at Harvard nonetheless. And I have friends who went to Harvard School of Education. I have multiple friends who I keep in contact with. So just the whole expert thing reminded me of this piece I wanted to talk about in the New York Times, and the article is titled "Sadness and Disbelief from a World Missing American Leadership." The coronavirus pandemic is shaking bedrock assumptions about U.S. exceptionalism. This is perhaps the first global crisis in more than a century where no one is even looking to Washington to lead. As images of America's overwhelmed hospital wards and snaking jobless lines have flickered across the world, people in the European side of the Atlantic are looking at the richest and most powerful nation in the world with disbelief. Quote, when people see these pictures of New York City, they say, "How can this happen? How is this possible?" said Heinrich Enderlein, president of the Berlin-based Hardy School, a university focused on public policy. "We are stunned. Look at the jobless lines, 22 million, he added. Quote, "I feel desperate sadness," said Timothy Garton-Ash, a professor of European history at Oxford University and lifelong ardent Atlanticist. "The pandemic sweeping the globe has done more than take lives and livelihoods from New Delhi to New York. It is shaking fundamental assumptions about American exceptionalism, the special role the United States played for decades after World War II, as the reach of its values and power made it a global leader and example to the world. Today, it is leading in a different way. More than 840,000 Americans have been diagnosed with COVID-19, and at least 46,784 have died from it, more than anywhere else in the world. As the calamity unfolds, President Trump and state governors are not arguing over what to do, but also over who has the authority to do it. Not only arguing about what to do, but also has the authority to do it. Mr. Trump has fomented protests against safety measures urged by scientific advisors, misrepresented facts, yada, yada, yada. America has not done badly, it has done exceptionally badly, said Dominique Moissy, a political scientist and senior advisor at the Paris-based Institut Montaigne. What's funny is, as evidence for how Europeans view the U.S., this author has cited 3 people. Did anybody catch the common thread of those 3 people? So, to review, I'll go in reverse order. Dominique Moissy, a political scientist and senior advisor of the Paris-based Institut Montaigne. And then Timothy Garton-Ash, professor of European history at Oxford. And then Heinrich Enderlein, president of the Berlin-based Hardy School, a university focused on public policy. So these are the elites in Europe. So the only grounding of this, attack on American exceptionalism in the eyes of Europe is from elites in Europe. What about the average person? What about the small business owner? What about business people in general? What about Sweden? What about UK? There's a whole bunch of other opinions in Europe than just 3 academics. Certainly we can know that. So I won't read the rest, but that's kind of that kind of exposes that narrow focus on a particular topic, and then when you branch outside of that, going back to the Thomas Sowell quote from the beginning, you may not know that you don't know what you're talking about. So emotion is so strong in today's society in forming our viewpoints, in anchoring our viewpoints, in making us resistant to alternative viewpoints. I would encourage you that if you find yourself getting mad, upset, triggered, angered, sad, whatever, just be wary, because those strong emotions are going to make you blind. They just are. They're gonna disrupt your reality, your situational awareness of what's going on, what's truth, what's fiction. And so just take a step, take a breath, take some time, let things develop, and then go back when you're calm and you can rationally look at the evidence and lines of reasoning. Sadly, what we do is we devolve and we kind of feed that emotional base, and then that exacerbates our blindness, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, and dare I say, sometimes indefinitely. So don't be one of those ones who's indefinitely blind through emotion. Join me in trying to analyze these issues in a helpful, healthy discussion that makes all of us more like grown-ups and not like fifth graders at recess shouting at each other. I'm Joel Van Brunt. Have a good night, and I will talk to you later.